Okay, hello everyone. My name is Gemma Yates. I am the Investor Engagement Lead at ACCR. I'll be hosting today. I would just like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm dialing in from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. Just to get through the normal housekeeping things before we get going, we are recording this presentation today, and the recording and the slides will be made available after the webinar. There will be Q&A at the end of the session, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions today, so please just add them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We have allowed an hour and 15 for today just because we thought it was quite a big subject. But if you do need to leave on the hour, that's absolutely fine as well. So thank you to everyone for joining us to discuss the opportunities and challenges in Australia's energy transition and what that might mean for AGL's transition. We understand this is a complicated conversation. I think that's probably an understatement. There are a number of vested interests, and if we were just relying on media headlines, then it may seem difficult to know what the next best step might actually be. So we have invited a couple of wonderful panelists to help us gain some clarity on this topic today. We have Stephanie Bashir, Dr Dylan McConnell, and ACCR's Harriet Cater on the panel today. Stephanie was just having some technical difficulties. You may not see her there just yet, but she will be back to present her section of the presentation. Stephanie has over 2 decades of experience in the Australian energy sector. She's the founder and the CEO of Nexa Advisory, advising a broad range of public and private clients, including renewable energy developers, investors, and climate impact philanthropists to help accelerate efforts towards a clean energy transition. Dr Dylan McConnell is a renewable energy and energy systems analyst at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. He has extensive experience in analysing the electricity sector in Australia. And Dylan's work is focused on electricity infrastructure and governance and the energy transition in liberalised electricity markets. Harriet, I think most of you know already. She's ACCR's impact lead and has also led our engagement with AGL over the last couple of years. So I'd now like to hand over to Harriet just to provide a short introduction.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and welcome everybody. Happy Monday. I hope you had excellent weekends wherever you are. Yes, as Gemma said, before I throw to our excellent speakers, we thought it might help to provide just a little bit of history on AGL and noting I only have 5 minutes, so it won't be a blow-by-blow account of the full circus in 2022, but just a bit of a reflection on where the company was and where it is now, and turning our minds to what the key sort of engagement priorities are with the company at this time. So, looking back at the years preceding the board overhaul at AGL in 2022 at that November AGM, safe to say that the national electricity market was not a friendly place for the owners and operators of large-scale coal generators. Every day was sort of getting headlines hypothesizing this could be the end for companies like AGL, and those earnings calls were always particularly painful times for the executives, the boards, but also shareholders. And this was because there was a period of suppressed electricity prices, and we were seeing the effects of significant rollout of large-scale renewables, as well as rooftop solar, eroding the returns of those large incumbent generators. And that was that's what led to the significant overhaul of the board at AGL, and particularly the absence, I guess, of the companies having a strategy for managing this transition. Here we are now, some photos of happy new board members on AGM day in 2022. I was there in the room. It was a pretty momentous day. And I think it's, through our dialogue with investors and even our own approach to the company, a decision was taken to give the company a fair bit of space after that momentous change that we saw that year, and to allow the dust to settle and to allow the new leadership to really get their feet under the table. Remembering, of course, that, the company was still searching for a new CEO on the day of that AGM. But I would say that whilst there was that desire to give the company space, there was a fair bit of optimism and high hopes that we would see some further announcements and further ambition coming from the company for how it was going to transition its business, and further enhancements on the climate plan that was presented to vote at that AGM. However, from early 2023, it might have started a bit earlier. The tone on what was happening in the national electricity market and the opportunity and challenges of the transition started to shift quite swiftly. A number of headlines here across, mainly from the AFR, just highlighting just suddenly the sort of slowdown of build out of replacement electricity for to facilitate the retirement of coal-fired generators. And I'm aware that Dylan will be talking to this and the causes of this further in his presentation. However, what that did lead also was to some sort of shift in tone and messaging from AGL itself. And so we had the CEO saying, "We're going as fast as we can in this difficult environment. Please sort of go easy on us. It's hard, and we're going as fast as we can." As well as having the chair sort of signalling that she wanted a more sort of realistic conversation around how we were going to get to net zero in Australia. And this was a concern for ACCR. This was not the sort of messaging that we really wanted to see from Australia's largest greenhouse gas emitter, and it was clearly a concern for the largest shareholder, GROC, as well. And this led to GROC issuing a letter to the AGL board at the time of the AGM in 2023, signalling its concern, particularly around the remuneration plan and the settings of those carbon transition metrics in that plan. So rather than force a second strike on the remuneration plan in 2023, GROC elected to abstain from that vote. But it did signal that it was really quite unimpressed by the sort of unambitious settings in the remuneration plan, and it had a concern that AGL was sort of watching the transition from the sidelines rather than being out and leading from the front. I will note that the new remuneration report was released in the annual report for AGL last week. And based on our analyst's first read, it does appear like not a lot has changed in that report. So it will be an interesting vote to watch at the AGM this year. And just finally, since last year's AGM, there have been a few announcements from the company. It has announced its new customer platform, Kaluza. There's also been a few enhanced sort of focus on the opportunities around firming assets, which I know Stephanie will talk to more, in part due to the what AGL describes as the tricky economics of owning large-scale generation assets. Last week, we also saw an announcement that Patricia McKenzie will be standing down as chair of AGL in February 2025 and replaced by renewable energy veteran Miles George. This was a very pleasing announcement from ACCR's perspective. We were always of the view that Patricia McKenzie was not the chair for AGL in this moment, and that was reflected in our commentary on voting in the lead up to the 2022 AGM as well. So that is, in our view, a positive sign, and may well be, a key change that is needed to drive what we view as, significantly enhanced ambition that we would like to see in the 2025 CTAP that will be put to a vote at the AGM next year. So that really is our key priority here at ACCR, engaging with the company and focusing on enhancing that ambition in that plan. But we are very cognizant that asks for enhancements do need to be grounded in reality and informed by the market in which AGL is operating within. And that is sort of a key reason for scheduling this webinar, really, and for bringing Dylan and Stephanie, two experts, along to help demystify what is going on out there and to inform our engagement asks with AGL. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing and throw to Dylan. He will pull up his own slides, and hopefully this is a seamless transition.
Thanks, Harriet, and thanks for inviting me along today. So yeah, I'm going to talk through a few things today. I'll start off by talking about the integrated system plan at a fairly high level. It's a fairly important document. I think I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, but I'll just do a quick overview of what that is for those that aren't. And then I'll go through essentially how we are tracking against that plan on both an energy and a capacity basis, looking at renewables and coal in particular. Talk about some of the causal factors that are causing some divergence between these projections and what's happening in the real world, and finish with a bit of a section on the role of gas, which is somewhat contested and controversial, and there's some nuance that needs to be understood about that as well. Okay, so first of all, the integrated system plan. So this is essentially a roadmap that's developed by the independent Australian energy market operator for the power system over the next 30 odd years. It's probably worth noting that it's not actually a government document or process. It's developed by the market operator. It does take into account various Commonwealth and state policies, but it is actually independent from state and federal government, and it is a very sort of iterative kind of process that gets updated every 2 years. We're up to the fourth version now. We've actually just started the fifth version, and it's not materially different to the version that was prepared under the previous coalition government. So it's not necessarily it's not a government document. I think that's an important thing to understand about this. It has a variety of roles. But I guess a key output and a key function is to identify where new transmission projects should go. And basically, it identifies what an optimal or a least cost development pathway for the energy system looks like. And a key output of that is articulation of where it makes sense to build new transmission lines. So that map on the right there is from the latest ISP, and that essentially shows a range of the transmission projects that the system operator thinks should be progressed. I guess the other key thing that comes through the ISP is where and how much generation capacity there needs to be. So notably, there is a lot of renewable energy projected to come online, a sort of six times increase in capacity over the next out to 2050, and actually a 3 times increase out to 2030. And importantly, a big chunk of that, and I think Stephanie will talk a little bit more about this later on, is on the distributed side of the meter. So this is, you can see there, that top part there is rooftop solar. And similarly, this is getting a bit more into the details, but around storage, a large amount of that storage that's projected is going to be from consumer energy resources. So that is behind the meter people, not your large scale utility scale stuff. How are we tracking against this? Not so great is probably the simple answer. So this is actually, this figure here shows the actual coal generation over the last decade or so versus projections of coal generation in the last 3 IS integrated system plans. And basically, well, a couple of things to highlight from this. You may be able to detect from that chart, there's actually a small uptick in the last financial year, very small, but it is an uptick nonetheless, which is, not the right direction. And the other thing to note is that over the last 3 iterations, the speed at which coal is projected to decline is actually increasing. We've gone from a system that's a projection of about a reduction of 6 terawatt hours, about 3.5%. 4 or 5% down to 13 terawatt hours, which is actually close to 10% per annum. The flip side of that is what's happening with renewables. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we're seeing the opposite opposite sort of dynamics. We basically have an increased projection in the speed of renewable rollout required, but in the sort of the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, we've been going at about a half to a third of what is projected to be required. So yeah, these are the numbers, I guess, just to put those numbers in context. So on the left-hand side, we have the historical figures there. We have what coal's done is declining in the range of 4 to 8-ish terawatt hours per year. But in the last financial year, it went up, and variable renewable energy going up about 9 terawatt hours per year. But then what that means, what we actually need to do is on that right table, and it's a quite substantial increase in the historical both growth in renewable energy and decline in coal. Essentially, you have to more than double the rate of renewable energy generation in the next 5 years. On to capacity. So this is not how much is actually being burnt, but how much sits in the market and is available. The sort of common, well, it is true that it's both projected to decline, and it's the announcement retirements are quite more, I guess, they're quite significant compared to the current installed fleet, but they're basically talking about in the sort of most likely scenario, 90% of coal being gone by 2035. But it's also worth noting that what is being announced, this is very much driven by assumptions, not driven by policy. So this is looking at what a system would look like if we meet these emissions targets. And in practice, this idea that coal is retiring faster than announced is perhaps not really borne by reality. In the last, at least in the last, iteration, the last cycle of the ISP, we've actually seen announced retirements slip since the last, notably Eraring, but also I think Vals Point and 1 or 2 others in the next decade, and out beyond. We have seen some brought forward, and that's mainly to do with the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan. With the renewable energy rollout, we have seen a pretty significant increase in the last 5 or 6 years compared to history. We've basically gone from installing less than a gigawatt per year up to 2.5-ish over the last 6 years. But putting that in the context of what is projected to be required, that's we really need to ramp that up yet again. So yeah, historically we've seen that, particularly in the last 6 years, we've seen about 2.5 gigawatts being added to the system per year, and we really need about 6.5 of utility scale and 9 in total, including renewable energy. So it's quite a significant of ramp up in the next 5 years, essentially. I guess it's important to talk about the why. What is the difference? What is causing this divergence? And I guess simplistically, and at a high level, it's because these projections are modelled outputs, and they are based on, importantly, the existence of a carbon budget. The market operator is looking at a least cost system in the context of constraining emissions to a carbon budget that's either consistent with a 1.5 degree world or a 2 degree world. In the real world, there is no such policy to drive a carbon budget. There's no carbon pricing. There's nothing to actually enforce that from happening. It's perhaps unsurprising that there's a bit of a difference between the ISP and what's happening in the real world, because one assumes carbon constraint, the other does not. So there's that's one of the key drivers. The other is that there's other factors that sit outside of this sort of techno-economic optimization that don't neatly fit into these sort of planning processes. And in particular, there's a sort of declining community acceptance and social license around renewable energy in some parts of the country. And there's planning challenges basically at the state level about building some of these projects that are also causing challenges to building out at the rate that is required. So historically, the way that this mismatch or this policy, the need to drive renewable energy was driven by the renewable energy target. So that's a federal certificate scheme, and there was a mandatory component to that drove a lot of investment, but the mandatory component was basically met 4 or 5 years ago now. There has been a bit of voluntary action off the back of this scheme, but basically that main policy driver doesn't do the same thing, and we've consequently seen a bit of a drop-off in that expansion of renewable energy. The sort of newly announced and developed and in-train capacity investment scheme has kind of emerged to fill this gap that exists between what is needed and what is projected to occur and what is actually happening. It's obviously fairly new and needs time to work, so it's too early to really say much solidly about this, but there's essentially a lot, I think, riding on the success of this to be able to bridge this gap and deliver the transition. Now, there's some higher level challenges around the electricity market. We have all of these interventions now to address the fact that we don't have some kind of carbon pricing or some macro policy to drive these investment decisions, and that introduces its own challenges and risks. So that at one level, that's I guess a problem with the capacity investment scheme, or a potential problem, is that it does introduce another intervention that does create challenges, but ideally it does. It's trying to strike the balance between not distorting the market too much and bringing forward some of these investments. But yeah, remains to be seen how this works in practice. The other sort of very newly announced thing is a Productivity Commission review that's expected to be launched soon, and that is another potential challenge around market settings. Things like it looks to be orienting towards a capacity mechanism for the electricity market, which introduces yet another layer of uncertainty. Another challenge, and that is transmission. This is a sector of the industry that is beset by delays all over the place. Also separate but similar social license challenges, which contribute to the delays and contribute to the cost escalations. And this is also presenting a challenge to things like closure of coal plants, build out of new renewable energy generation, and so on. And we've basically seen across the board a pretty significant across the board delay in these big infrastructure projects. There's a couple of notable cases, but really it's pretty common to see these have more than 100 times 100% capex blowouts, and also years of delays, which presents all sorts of coordination challenges for bringing on new renewables as well as closing coal. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the role of gas, because that's one that's a bit of nuance around this, and essentially we see one of the sort of high level lines from the market operator is that we're seeing that we need 15 gigawatts of gas, up from 11.5 gigawatts today, and that's essentially what this figure here is showing. There's a couple of things that we'll go into in a little more detail. One is the distinction between flexible gas and fossil gas. The other fact is that it actually declines in the next decade. Not much, but there's no need for this in the very short term. So that's the capacity. That's an important part to managing flexibility. The other part is to think about is actually how much gas is being generated. It's important that even though this capacity exists, it's going to be very underutilized, or it's going to have very low capacity factors. There's actually projected to be a quite significant decline in gas generation in terms of megawatt hours produced. This does present some challenges for financing this potentially, and certainly the operation of the gas network. And the other important part of this is it's not necessarily needed to be fossil gas, partly because of the challenges with running a network at these low utilizations. It may be liquid fuels, things like diesel, and even better, it may even be things that are sort of hydrogen-derived fuels like methanol or some other technology that is both easy to store and with lower carbon footprint, which is may become more important if we ever do end up having a carbon price or something that values emissions. Just to quickly summarize, utility scale generation really needs to dramatically increase, commensurate decline in coal generation if we are going to stay in line with these projections. There's basically a mismatch between what is projected and what exists in the real world. Hopefully the capacity investment scheme may address this. And there's ongoing challenges with building out large infrastructure, both renewable energy and transmission. On gas, yes, these projections do suggest we need more dispatchable capacity, but not in the immediate term, and it may not necessarily need to be fossil gas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and we'll have an opportunity to throw some questions to Dylan. Stephanie, how are you going with your connection? Do you want to see if you can share your slides? I have them on standby here as well if you need me.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to present to you this afternoon. And just kind of to pick up on the agenda, I'll really be presenting the opportunity for organizations like AGL in the transition going forward. So firstly, really, we've heard there's a lot of challenges, obviously, but it's not all that bad. We are on a global decarbonisation mission, and that really sets us in a good place. We're not the only country, and we're not expecting our corporate investors in Australia to do that. The new programs in the United States, in the European Union and Asia are all accelerating the energy transition. And there is a lot of capital, private capital and public capital that's being injected. And that really is a big opportunity. I would say here as well that we have had a lot of challenges and we've had a slow start with the political debates at the federal level, but the states really have made significant contributions to keeping things going in what was a stalemate situation over the last decade in terms of their net zero commitments by 2050 and also their commitments to renewables by 2030. And I think that basically provided quite a bit of the investment that Dylan mentioned over the last 5 years in the transition. Of course, there's a lot of conversations about what's the future going to look like, but it's very clear that it is a renewables and energy storage future. It is the cheapest and currently most available and fastest to build. And with the coal power stations actually planned closures over the coming decade, whether they're planned as scheduled under the projections or with a slight delay, at some stage, the coal power stations do have to exit the system because they are reaching their end of life. And they do present some challenges from a reliability perspective in terms of unplanned outages, as we have seen over the last 6 months with Eraring being tripped, and that really does escalate the price of wholesale electricity. But really what this slide is really trying to demonstrate, and we have used very similar data to Dylan's presentation, which is the AEMO ISP step change, is that year on year, there is a significant wind and solar at the utility scale investment needed to replace the thermal coal. And we need to build, based on these projections, AEMO highlight that we need to build 6 gigawatts of renewable generation each year. And at the moment, really, we're only tracking at the current rate of 2 to 3 gigawatts. The key opportunity really in the transition is the demand for batteries, and that's really growing at speed. The utility scale batteries in the transition basically presents a huge opportunity, especially with the volatility in the energy market of the power stations, weather conditions, renewable generation being dispatchable. Batteries really is seen as a key factor and a contributor to the energy transition. And AEMO forecasts that we need storage capacity of 22 gigawatts by 2030. At the moment, we've got 3 gigawatts in the system. While there is a lot of appetite and projects being proposed in the pipeline, especially coming out of the capacity investment scheme that Dylan mentioned earlier, there is still a huge opportunity and a gap to fill by the private and investor sector in this space. When we're talking about batteries, it's important to note the revenue streams that are evolving for batteries. At the moment, there's really 2 key revenue streams, the energy arbitrage and the F-gas revenue. from providing the various market services that are needed by AEMO, but more and more there is a growing capacity and other revenues in terms of contracts, power purchase agreements. It's important to note that currently the power purchase agreements is quite limited in terms of competition, and it's dominated by the big incumbent players like AGL, Origin, and EA. And the reason for that is that I guess the PPA market, the financiers, and the lending organizations really require an offtake party that has a very high credit rating, creating a dependence on the incumbent players. What that means is that actually it presents a huge opportunity for big players like AGL to invest at a much higher scale in batteries and support the PPA market. Just noting also that in terms of the capacity in other contracts, noting that AGL with their 250 megawatt Torrens battery delivered 70 to 80% of its revenue from dispatchable capacity. That's not available to merchant products and merchant market developers. We've also had a seismic shift in federal policy since the Labor government. And while that's happened, we still need quite a lot in terms of moving things along a lot faster. As Dylan mentioned, transmission continues to be a huge block. And while we've had the CIS, we've had the New South Wales electricity roadmap and the tenders that have been coming through, the long-term service agreements there, which have been oversubscribed, both for the capacity investment scheme and the LTESA and New South Wales. Basically the track to get the renewables online fast has been quite a challenge. A lot of it is, as Dylan mentioned, the planning and approval processes are very slow, the connections, but really the CIS fundamentally requires transmission for all these projects to be delivered and connected. And while we've had a lot of growth in commercial and rooftop solar, there is continuous growing momentum in electric vehicle uptake and electrification. That means the significant demand and loads will continue to provide a strong foundation for the electricity system. And so I'll move now into the small scale part of the transition, which continues to play a really big role. So while we're building the big stuff, and obviously we talked about the delays, and small scale does provide a significant contribution. AEMO really looks at this as a key contributor in the integrated system plan as we move forward. Currently, the contribution from behind the meter PV and batteries is a third of the generation, which is quite big in terms of its impact. Oh, yeah. And the key reason, and I'll mention this very briefly, the key reason why Australians invest in distributed energy, this is basically a survey that was conducted by Energy Consumers Australia last year, is the first reason is to save money. The second reason is to increase their independence from main electricity providers. And the third reason is to protect their environment. And this is really important in the context of rooftop solar, because a lot of the predictions in the AEMO ISP, when it comes to the behind the meter battery, is about controlling the assets behind the meter for consumers. The other huge opportunity that currently is untapped is in the commercial and industrial space. So these are the businesses, not just the big end of town smelters and that. These are basically commercial businesses, small and large, in the market that could benefit from the untapped potential of having rooftop solar and batteries. At the moment, there's a significant share that could be installed at the C&I facilities, such as warehouses, which have roof space that could generate the power in excess of their actual need. Remembering that a lot of this also not only benefits the customers, but it also helps with the energy transition to make sure that we can close call when it's due, rather than continuous delays that we're seeing. The other opportunity, and obviously there's a lot of retailers investing in this, is the virtual power plants. Virtual power plants are not new. They've been in trials now with ARENA for 7 years, and really it's about the coordination of the consumer assets behind the meter in times where there is a market need or a grid need, where they would get a value or a contribution. But these types of orchestration products have been slowed down by regulatory barriers like the electricity distribution network tariffs, and by the ongoing, I guess, various vested interests by the multiple participants in the market. The key thing also is the need for social acceptance, for people to allow the electricity companies and businesses to orchestrate their assets when they're needed. And that requires basically earning their trust, but also making sure that they're getting a value out of it. And a lot of the value at the moment is very small because of the regulatory barriers in the network space. I will just mention this very quickly to put things in context, but the gentailers do have significant market power advantage today. Despite the 20 years of privatization and deregulation, they still dominate in terms of retail and wholesale because of their competitive advantage and vertical integration and size and scale. This is also a very big opportunity for them to basically think about how do they move their business model from the traditional push of sending people a bill to a more of a two-way business model where increasingly consumers are asking for more, and they are looking at taking more control from their energy. And this is really important to note, because more and more the biggest growth, I guess, in the adoption of clean technology is rooftop solar, and that's obviously been going on for a long time. And the main drivers, while early days, has been the government feed-in tariffs that were introduced. But as the technology costs dropped, this has continued to increase at scale. And this really does present a huge opportunity, even though it might be cannibalizing, or might be seen as cannibalizing, the traditional business model for the gentailers. And I say that because it's really important that got to be innovation and genuine innovation, or they stand to be disrupted quite significantly. And the disruption isn't really going to come only from the small retailers that are offering similar services or cheaper products in the market. The real disruption is going to be coming from large electricity network distribution regulated monopolies. And we're seeing that at the moment being played out. The Energy Networks Australia has basically put out their policy strategy on behalf of their members, and they are looking at basically getting into electric vehicle charging, getting at community batteries, providing energy as a service in the market, and they seem to be getting a lot of the momentum from, especially at the federal state at the moment, in doing that. The key risk in the proposal, these are regulated monopolies, and so they get a regulated return on their investment. And so competing with the private markets, there's a huge risk of distortion and encroaching in the private market sector from competing with regulated monopolies. And they are really pushing very hard at abolishing what is known as the ring fencing regulation that basically provides that strict separation between regulated activities versus non-regulated activities. Why is this important? We've seen also over the last few months, sustained orchestrated campaigns from the likes of Ausgrid, Endeavour, Essential, Energy Queensland, a lot of these and City Power, Powerco in Victoria. Ausgrid, for example, is partly owned by the state and partly owned by IMF, and they are being pushed really to go hard in how do they expand their regulatory asset base beyond the existing restrictions of poles and wires. So I guess with all of that, really, we see that there is a huge role for the private and investor sector in driving the transition. And in the absence of the private sector and investor sector in these different models stepping up, there is a risk of disruption. I've put this slide up because we follow the Edelman Trust Barometer. One of the key things that came out this year, when even though consumers don't trust their electricity providers and don't have a trust that they will do what's in their best interests, when it comes to business innovation, consumers do see a huge they trust the businesses a lot more than they would government or NGOs or others to deliver innovation. I will just really finish up on a couple of things. Competitive neutrality in the market for players in retail is going to be really important. Really, the private and investor sector, both at the large scale and the small scale, will play a really significant role through key action and influence in driving the transition and how quickly and how big it can go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm going to jump in now and facilitate the Q&A. As Gemma mentioned, we did schedule for this webinar to go a bit past midday. I think we may need to do that, but obviously we understand if people have meetings that commence at midday that you may have to dash. So please encourage everyone to add questions to the chat. Thank you very much, Max, for your contributions. And before we get to those questions from Max, I thought I'd just ask a more general question of both Stephanie and Dylan. As investors are preparing for their engagements with AGL on the 2025 transition plan, where do you see the greatest opportunity for a company or the gentailers like AGL to influence the speed of the transition in this current environment?
Yeah, sure. I guess this is quite close to some of the stuff that that Stephanie sort of pointed at, is this sort of innovative be disrupted kind of idea. Phrased alternatively, I'd say, one of the biggest assets, for one of the better word, is all of the customers that AGL has and gentailers in general, and that's that's where we see a lot of innovation in the retail space is people trying to steal customers use develop some of these innovative approaches and platforms and so on. If that gives you an idea that is actually a valuable thing to have, and this is where with the role of distributed energy resources, both behind the meter, rooftop solar and other behind the meter resources, both battery and rooftop solar, are projected to have such a significant part of the system. It's been such a big part of the system that is actually, I think, an advantage for the big generators to take advantage of, or have it taken away from them from others.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dylan. And Stephanie, I'm conscious I'm sort of asking you to repeat yourself, but was there anything you wanted to hone in on in response to that question?
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously, as Dylan said, there's huge potential in the residential and business sector in terms of innovation, and but I think flexibility that batteries at the utility scale provide is a really big opportunity. And I think there could be a lot more done by companies like AGL. I saw that they presented their flexibility plans of 9 gigawatts. A lot of that is gas and coal, but utility energy storage is actually going to be really big it's already huge. And they could play a big role in driving that a lot faster and have bigger ambitions.
Thank you. And I guess it is just maintaining that challenge to themselves about not sort of viewing these investments as cannibalizing their current business model, more as a defensive play to further impact the transition. Yeah.
And the key thing is really the whole thing about cannibalizing their own business model. If they don't, they're already being cannibalized by others.
Yeah.
And so they need to move fast.
Yeah. And those difficult years in the lead up to the 2022 AGM may feel like the far off distance, but they could very well come again. Okay, we will turn to the questions in the chat. So first from Max, what signals, if any, do you think have been sent by enrolling the Productivity Commission to lead the post-2030 NEM review rather than the existing three market bodies of AEMC, AER, AEMO, etc.?
My sense of that is essentially because we tried the other three before. We did the post-2025 process, you may or may not remember, through the Energy Security Board, and I'd be happy to say that I think that was a bit of a failure. And so part of it is trying to avoid the mistakes of the ESB and that approach. Also, just from a process perspective, it does make sense to not have the energy market institutions reviewing themselves. So I, on that level, I think it is a good thing that the Productivity Commission is doing it. Or but that said, it does it's a fairly limited or targeted review as far as the draft terms of reference for it go. It's not, it's certainly not looking at carbon pricing, or it's not even looking at transmission or distribution. It's very much reliability. Well, it seems to be targeting reliability settings, and some potentially quite significant changes to wholesale market design. So that will unfortunately bring some uncertainty to the situation as well.
Thanks, Dylan. Stephanie, did you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think that was very well answered.
I might jump down to a question from Peter now. Peter Brook is after some more detail on why removing the ring fencing will reduce competitive neutrality. Often more incentives for new players will lead to more challenges to incumbency, not less. Does anyone want to have a go at that one? I wouldn't know where to start.
I'll have a go, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for your question. It's a very good question. I guess, the ring fencing rules for regulated monopolies was introduced for a reason. They get a return on investment for the regulated assets they invest in. And so the public pays for that, energy consumers pay for that. And so when privates have to compete with regulated funding, it's very difficult, and it does crowd out the private market. And so the idea is that it's not about increasing ring fencing. It's about making sure that it's not abolished because it was there for a reason. This doesn't mean that the electricity networks can't enter the competitive market. They absolutely can under unregulated businesses and compete at an equal footing like everyone.
Great, thank you. All right, another question from Max. So I've had feedback from the industry that it's difficult to move faster on battery storage as there are delays in the supply chain. Meanwhile, lithium prices have crashed and there are many reports of growing inventory in the EV supply chain. Have you seen evidence of growing times in secure batteries for grid storage when we're seeing the opposite further upstream?
I can have a quick crack at that.
Thanks,
in that, look, battery supply chains are a little bit beyond what I know about, so I don't know the specifics of what's going on there, but I do know that there are projects, Capital Battery comes to mind, that have experienced significant delays in the last little period, and that's partly around connection and other sort of planning related issues. But yeah, sort of anecdotally, there are reports of a slow, or some of these projects not being delivered as fast as expected. But I don't really know if I don't have a good sense of if that's supply chain related or connection related. And yeah, so a partial answer.
No, thanks, Dylan. Stephanie, did you want to add anything to that one?
I would just say that really the supply chain really does present an opportunity for Australia as a whole in terms of how we deal with it, who we partner up with globally to make sure that we're not left out. It is something that the federal government, I guess, is looking into at the moment with the recent budget.
Okay, thank you. Throwing to a AGL specific one now. So from Moana, I was interested to hear about the innovate or be disrupted anecdote. Could you please provide your view on what AGL is doing well in this space I'm guessing from an innovation perspective? Stephanie, you've had a bit of a look at some of the sort of products and things that AGL is offering. Would you be happy to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be happy to answer it for what's available in the public, I guess. And so just looking at the recent presentation, the yearly results, you know, their investment in Caluso and moving away from SAP because it gives them that agility to provide these, if you like, innovative products and services to customers is a good move. I guess some of the things that I talk about in my presentation goes a little bit beyond that, in that perhaps there is a lot more that AGL can do, especially that they do hold one of the top 3 large customer asset bases. And so, you know, the concern that solar is cannibalizing the retail business model is something of the past. And I think that really needs to be reviewed in light of the current dynamics and what's coming up.
Thank you. And I would say that just from an ACCR perspective, whilst we are still finalising our views and asks of AGL with regard to the next CTAP, you know, we're not coming at this thinking, you know, all is lost and it's disastrous. You know, I think there's a view that the company is heading in the right direction, but we are just wanting to see, you know, greater ambition and greater speed coming through in that transition plan. One more question that's come through from Max. So, do you see pumped hydro as a viable investment option for non-government entities like AGL and Origin? GenX is close to finishing Kidston, but this was arguably only possible with the support of funding and grants from NAIF and others.
It's very challenging, I think. There's a couple of different ways to think about this, but well, actually it goes a little bit to Max's previous point on you know, the glut of lithium in the global sort of supply chain. If you look at the projections, you know, pumped hydro is having its lunch eaten by chemical storage, and even at moderately long duration, sort of even up to, I think, you know, 24 hours by 2030, batteries are going to take that market. Well, they're going to be the least cost option there. So it does look challenging, and it has some other cost related challenges, or capex, direct capex related challenges, in that these are large mega projects. They have the same project problems as many other mega projects we've seen, and the benefits you get from modular technologies, you know, don't apply. So I think it is looking particularly challenging for pumped hydro across the board. With I would say that a caveat, sort of going back to that previous comment around the Productivity Commission review, you know, there could be some significant changes to the electricity market structure or wholesale market structure that mean that investment in long duration storage, you know, like pumped hydro, might make more sense. But yeah, there's a separate question around whether it's even good at providing long duration storage. So I would say challenging.
Thanks, Dylan. Stephanie, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention 2 things. We did a review of energy storage financeability in Australia earlier this year, and one of the key findings was that we do need long duration storage, but right now the financeability of it is really difficult. And so for us to have it in place in 10 years' time, it does require quite a bit of public, you know, government underwriting, especially that currently we don't have the market services to value energy storage and batteries in the medium to longer term. You know, the FCAS market that I mentioned and the energy volatility They are right here, right now, and we need these new market services that value the new services that battery and energy storage bring to come into the market, and that's a role for government and the market bodies.
Okay, great, thanks. So possibly some policy advocacy opportunities there for both the likes of AGL and potentially its shareholders. We are past midday and we have run out of questions in the chat, so I think we might conclude this Q&A. Thank you everyone for your participation. I will throw back to Gemma.
Thank you everyone for joining today. Obviously, we will send out the webinar recording to everyone who's registered today, but if you have follow-up questions for either of our panelists or for us on AGL, please just reach out. We're obviously more than happy to catch up with anyone to talk in more detail in the next weeks or months. So thank you again for your time, and we'll look forward to catching up later.